As the suspension of normality provided by lockdown comes to an end, our former problems are once again becoming vivid. In the United States of America, the problem sort of race and racial brutality are obviously coming to the forefront. We are looking at some of these incidents with Professor Kehinde Andrews of Birmingham University in order to try and understand more clearly the roots of racism, the underlying attitudes that create racism, and indeed what is the solution to racism. When something as serious and vivid as the George Floyd murder takes place, what is there to add to the conversation on race?
Well, I think it's just a reminder of what the stakes are, because like what we see in there in that video, that's not new. It's been happening for centuries. Happens in the UK as well. Actually, it's really interesting with when you see deaths through restraint, because that's how most of the deaths here happen by the police. I think the main thing you see now is you just get to see these things, whereas before you wouldn't necessarily see them.
The kind of idea we've had that liberal progressivism gives us, that generally things are improving, you think is an entirely false narrative?
Oh, completely. I mean, you can see that in basically all of the statistics around racial inequality. If you look at housing, if you look at employment, if you look at education, if you look globally, and what these reminders of when you see the videos of the police brutality. And then police are like the boots on the ground of racism. They're on a hard edge. You can just see it really, really clearly and can't deny what you're seeing. But that's just a product of everything else. And we shouldn't see this as being surprising or separate. It's produced by everything else that goes on in society.
So you think that the significant change is not that racism is getting worse, not that racism is improved, just that racism is more visible, is recordable, and that an extreme incident like this that's captured on film is exemplary of incidents that we would never see, never hear about, that would just be recorded, as you say, as death through restraint or various other ways of bureaucratically concealing brutality.
There's nothing new here. It's just the same thing again and again. And I think one of the ways you could see that would be, so a lot of the focus is on Trump's response, but Black Lives Matter started under Barack Obama. Meaning he's had exactly the same videos. In fact, the first I Can't Breathe, Eric Garner, that was under a black president. So we look at these things which seem to be progress. They're not progress at all. The underlying truth is that black and brown life matters a lot less. It's undervalued. It can be killed. It's subject to this kind of abuse. And the real only difference is that we just get to see it now, and the images go around the world.
Say at the moment like this, when there is the subsequent outrage and anger, what would stop this happening?
So actually, one of the problems with the response is that the way we see racism, like Malcolm X, my go-to, obviously, talks about the difference between the southern wolf and the northern fox. And so the southern wolf is the openly racist, Trump, police brutality. You know, he calls it the bloody jawed wolf. And you can see that really clearly. And that's what we always respond to. But the bigger problem actually is the northern fox. That's Malcolm says they show you their teeth, but they pretend they're smiling. And essentially, it's all liberal and it's all, yeah, let's do the right thing. And so let's make these particular changes, but it's still exactly the same, right? But we always focus our attention on the fox and not the wolf. And the wolf is the one that we actually go to the fox for solutions. So let's get better police training. Let's get a better president. Let's get a DA. They're all part of the same problem, right? And until we actually start looking at the bigger problem, is that how do we reshape and reorganize society? We're just going to keep again and again and again, you're going to get the same outcome.
This vivid, obvious example of brutality and racism, the George Floyd murder, has come after a disturbing, but in terms of consequence, less severe example of racism, but perhaps the one that aligns with the kind of Malcolm X fox wolf metaphor that you're describing, the incident between Christian Cooper, Amy Cooper, the bird watcher, and the dog walker. How do you think that fits into the story of race on our planet at the moment?
That's really something where we wouldn't have seen that interaction before, but that interaction has a long history. I mean, if you go back to Emmett Till being lynched by a white mob because the white lady said that he whistled at her when he was only 14, visiting family in the South. And so, but again, we don't really see that. You don't ever see those things. And I'm sure Amy Cooper would have, before this, would have seemed like a liberal, well-to-do in New York, white diversity, et cetera, but the mask was just ripped off really clearly in that video. And that's the problem. Like typically we kind of see her now as being this wolf. Oh, isn't she so racist? But I bet really in a everyday life, she just go around thinking she's quite liberal. But it shows the mask has slipped. And again, that's because of social media. We can see the mask has slipped. But that mask is very much there.
Like, how does this relate to, say, a big subject like reparation?
Seems like a small thing, but they're totally, what was she doing? She was saying, I'm going to call the police and say an African-American man's attacking me, and my life's in danger. The consequence could have been the same as the consequence you saw with George Floyd. I mean, that's basically essentially what she's done. They're just lucky the police never found him. So they are very, very, very much connected. We think about one as being less extreme than the other, but they're both produced by exactly the same thing. Why did she think it was a threat to a black man that I'm going to call the police? Because this is what the police do, right? And so those kind of attitudes are really, really tight. They're all tied in. So you can't really separate out what we think of being the smaller acts to the bigger acts. And that does go back to this question of, well, what do you do about it? And it isn't about, so the liberal way of thinking of racism is you can kind of educate people. At least if we see it, then we can change it and people are going to change their minds and do something. That's complete nonsense, because it's not like people don't know. People have known for a while now. You have to actually change the structure, fundamentally overhaul it, because this is what this society does. It puts black people at the bottom, white people at the top. There's a hierarchy in between, and this is just one of the outcomes. So yeah, you would have to have, well, I say revolution, other people say reparations. But yeah, you can't deal with this through any other way than changing the political and economic base of what our society is.
Perhaps then one of the reasons that the issue of race is never successfully addressed is because in order to address it, you would have to challenge the very pillars of the system that is dependent upon these racist attitudes for its sustenance.
Yes, that's why I've said this to you before about the whiteness being a psychosis. It's a delusional state of being which produces the George Floyd example. It produces the Amy Cooper example. But like with any psychosis, the purpose of a psychosis is to delude you into thinking everything's fine. And if you actually were to understand that our day-to-day life, the progress that we have, the money that we have, the wealth that we have, is produced by the same violence that kills George Floyd, and you have to change all of that, then nobody want to do it, right? And so that's why you actually have to change the society. It's not about changing people's minds.
What do you consider are the political implications? Because you seem like, when we talk, like a very peaceful, harmonious man, but I know that you're pretty fundamentalist and radical when it comes to the solutions to this problem.
You could be peaceful and you could be radical, right? I mean, actually, it's interesting because Malcolm has reputation for violence, and Malcolm rhetorically certainly talks about violence, but actually he committed no acts of political violence either in the Nation of Islam or without. The big difference for Malcolm is in the nation, he's still kind of trapped in that way of thinking nationally. So if we segregate black people and if black people can just have our own economy within America, that'll be fine, right? But that doesn't solve the problem. The problem is America. The problem is the West. Being embedded within it is never going to make any difference, right? The difference when he changes and goes to the more radical Malcolm is that he understands that actually this is it's a global situation. So the things that happen in America, they're just more extreme examples of what happened here or happened in South Africa. And so actually what you have to do is you have to have a complete restructuring of society. And Malcolm's talking about the Black Revolution, the African Revolution. But I was making it clear that like the West has to end for racism to end. The West and racism are like this. You cannot separate them out. It has to go, and we have to build something new.
Yes, that there is an intrinsic, inherent link between America and indeed Great Britain and racism. You can't have a not racist Great Britain. You can't have a not racist America. You have to create an entirely different thing if what you want to do is end racism. And if not, then you have to accept that what you want is to move more into the fox territory out of the wolf territory, and you just don't want to look as racist, say.
Kind of, but even black people, like what's one of the things that we struggle for is survival, because it is life and death. Like the police can kill you. I am more likely to go out of my house and be killed by the police. Even in my elevated class position, that's still a fear for me and my family, right? And so because the symptoms of racism are deadly, we often focus on those symptoms. But just like with anything, if you just treat the symptoms and don't treat the disease, you're always going to be sick. You might live a bit better, you might be a bit more comfortable, but you're still going to be sick. And the disease is capitalism.
Yeah, because capitalism is about the mobilization of resources, whether they're human resources or economic or ecological resources, in order to serve an existing power structure, and that power structure excludes certain people. Yeah, I get it.
It's not a coincidence that the resources they're extracted are largely from Africa. The labor that's being brutally exploited is largely in Asia, black and brown people. That's not a coincidence. That's from the birth of capitalism. That's dependent on racism. You can't separate them.
If it was a coincidence, it would be an extraordinary one. How does these two incidents correlate to Joe Biden's remark to Charlemagne the God?
But I tell you, if you have a problem figuring out whether you're for me or Trump, then you ain't black.
Right, so Joe Biden's the fox, although for large parts of his career he was also the wolf. But let's say now he's the fox, right? He's the being nice to you, coming to our side, etc., etc. And the sad reality is that because of the lack of choice, Democrat or Republican, Labour or Conservative, it's actually not wrong, right? Like, and this is why 90% of black people vote for the Democrats, and 80% of black people vote for Labour in the UK, because the choice is so constrained. But that choice being constrained is the problem, right? Neither Democrats or the Republicans are good for black people, but they're stuck in a position, black people in America are stuck in a position where they kind of have to vote for the Democrats and do this religiously all the time, but gets us literally nowhere, right? And that's what this should be saying, that actually Joe Biden's the fox, and he's not good for you. And hopefully the mask, and that's again, the mask is slipped, because this is something which the Democratic Party have taken for granted for decades. I mean, Malcolm was complaining about this in the 60s. They take for granted the black vote, because who else are you going to vote for? But they don't usually say it in these terms. So here you see, like with the Amy Cooper example, the mask has slipped. Biden's just giving you, hey, yeah, they were taking you for granted. Blah, blah, blah. But that's really the problem. He's not wrong. That's the big problem. He's not wrong. He's right. If you're Democratic, you can't have to vote for Joe Biden. He's terrible. I mean, Joe Biden's awful. But what choice do you have if you're black and in America?
I suppose the big challenge is that these kind of incidents, whether they are incidents of discourse, of social racism, or, as you say, the most obvious, vivid, murderous consequences, all come from the same place. And this will not change unless there are a kind of radical changes that not only would people that are open, gun-toting, flag-waving racists, but even more cozy, mask-wearing racists don't want that kind of change. A lot of people are very, very frightened of the kind of change that would bring about a fair and just society.
Yeah, and unfortunately, a lot of us now are kind of afraid of that too, because the big change from the 60s is that we weren't part of it. 50 years ago, 60 years ago, we weren't really part of it. Like the kind of racism we're seeing on TV now was more common, right? That kind of open, until 1965 in both the US and the UK, I believe. It was perfectly fine to say, I'm not going to hire you because you're black. You can't live in my house because you're black. You don't like black people, right? So we were very clearly outside the system. And that's why you had revolutionary politics. People were like, well, look, they don't want us, let's do something else. What's happened over the last 50, 60 years is that it's opened up enough. You can't racially discriminate anymore. You can't have a black president. You can't have black professors. And now us here, a lot of our social movements are really about how do we get just a bit better off in this system, rather than saying, how do we end this system? Because the system's terrible, not just for us here, but black people globally, forget about it. So I think even for us, sometimes we've kind of changed our political goals in a pretty negative way, if I'm honest.
May I ask, do you think the same is true of gender or sex politics and economic class-based politics as well? That people oughtn't be looking for equality within this system, but a radical change to the system itself?
Yeah, and that's always been the limit of the left in the West, is that really oftentimes the debates are about how do we share out the spoils of empire rather than how do we actually do anything better. So, for example, like a lot. And this is, again, if you look at the fox, the wolf works. The fox and the wolf works quite well here as well, because if you think about neoliberalism, Thatcherism, Trump, they've kind of become the bogeyman, and it's like, well, how do we go back to social democracy? Let's just have higher taxes. Okay, but my dad and my grandmother came to this country during social democracy and experienced worse, actually, like wolf racism that I've ever experienced. Still were locked out of the union, still couldn't get good jobs. So social democracy going back doesn't deal with any of those problems. And let alone the bigger problem, which is where does all this wealth come from? The exploitation of black and brown people from the places that we've left and then now feel more comfortable with. So yeah, there's a huge this system can't provide equality for it can't. It's not supposed to. Not supposed to. Never meant to. And I'm not sure why we keep wanting it to.
I suppose much of my interest in your work is derived from the fact that I think that the narratives in which you are an expert are, of course I'm interested in them as a compassionate person who cares about people that happen to not be the same colour as me, but also because I think that the paradigm is applicable in pre-colonial power dynamics and post, in that there are always oppressed groups, like prior to colonisation, peasant class, serf class, that unless their focus becomes on uniting to create new systems, they will simply settle for a few tokenistic compromise instead of getting genuine, legitimate change for all.
Yeah, I mean, that is the history of everything, right? Like people generally just want to be okay. And you understand that. Like people want to be able to eat, want to be comfortable. These are obvious things people need. But we need to understand there's a much broader situation happening. That's why I always say blackness is a revolutionary concept in itself, because once I connect my struggle into all black people across the world, I had to see things differently. You can't see things in this national nation state. You just can't, right? Because look what happens in South Africa or the Congo or other places where life's getting significantly worse. And I guess the question would be, and I think about it a lot, like, because the what should white people do question, the bigger question is, can you find that humanism if you're not black? Like, can you really appreciate that, and can you really look at global equality and say, actually, this is all of our problem? Unfortunately, the history says probably not, but let's have some hope, right?
I think I'll take that as a good place for a conclusion. Thank you very much for helping to illuminate this, well, not complex, but interesting issue. Cheers, mate.
No worries, thank you.
I was very interested in Kehinde Andrews' point that no matter what the apparent severity of the racism is, it comes from the same resource. It's a manifestation of the same attitude, and the attitude goes beyond cultural racism of different individual people having different biases and prejudices, although that's a component of it. The real problem, as Kehinde says, as a result of his own experiences and his own studies, let's not forget that this is a professor, many years of experience and deep understanding, that the problem is capitalism itself, saying that the systems themselves are inherently racist, built on colonialism, built on imperialism. And in fact, I draw an analogy from Enoch Powell, which he would have loved. Enoch himself, I mean, because what Enoch Powell said once is, if Britain wasn't a monarchy, it's no longer Britain. You can't have Britain without a monarchy. Britain is a monarchy. If it's not a monarchy, it's not Britain anymore. Powell said it's like having an elephant without a trunk. If it doesn't have a trunk, it's not an elephant. So the point that Kehinde Andrews is making, and indeed Enoch Powell, obviously with very different aims in mind, is that built into the very structure of a system are certain requirements, certain attitudes. What is America built on? You cannot ever escape the fact that there was a genocide and that there was slavery. What is Britain built on? Colonialism and imperialism. That's what these countries are. I'm not saying that, you just some person living in Coventry or some person living on Rhode Island are, therefore evil. That's not actually relevant. It's saying that the systems themselves are intrinsically racist. And if you want to see an end to this type of incident, if you indeed believe in a different type of society, then you must challenge all of it. You must be willing to leave all of it. And the reason I'm pretty happy with that is because that's what I believe anyway, without any personal experience of racism, just from my own understanding of how we ought to organise society so it is more fair, just, equal, kind and loving. In short, an expression of who we really are, because this cannot be who we really are, can it?